All right, so today we're going to speak about, Rishus Rabbi Bleich and Rabbi Willig, we're going to speak about Ribbis Pegurim, payment arrears, in a very specific context, and that's the context of enforcement of judgments in courts, because courts will impose a statutory interest in the collection of judgments. So let's say somebody is entitled to a certain amount of money. The court comes to that conclusion. They will often say, okay, you're entitled to the money, but because you really should have gotten paid the money a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, whatever it is. So therefore, we're also going to include in the judgment various costs and expenses. We're going to include attorney's fees and court costs and things of that sort, which are relatively commonplace, but we're also going to impose a certain amount of statutory interest. Often that's referred to as a Ribbis Pegurim. And the process has been spoken about in various Torah journals, Shuvos, Piskei Din, and the like. It's sometimes referred to as the Hutza'ah Lepoel process, the enforcement of a judgment process. Are you allowed to collect costs in the enforcement of judgments? The answer is, yeah, generally speaking. If a Beis Din gives a person the right to go and enforce, let's say, the collection of a Beis Din judgment in court, so we'll also say you can collect attorney's fees and costs. That's part of maybe the knas that's going to be imposed for not paying the judgment. But what about the statutory interest? It seems like much more of a Ribbis problem. And is that something which is permitted or not? Why would the person be in civil court to begin with? So one possibility is that they violated the Isser or Kol. So then we have bigger fish to fry, or more fish to fry, in terms of the Isser Gezel, the Isser or Kol, so that's being committed. But let's assume, for purposes of this discussion, that the person legitimately is in civil court. I can think of three possible scenarios where a person is legitimately in civil court to enforce a judgment. One is if it's a chov boror, that it's an unquestionable, undebated undebated obligation that is being enforced. There's a promissory note. The debtor doesn't deny that he owes the money, and it's just a question of an enforcement action. With Rav Mordechai Eliyahu wrote an article in Tchumen. A lot is based on the Maharsham. What the Maharsham meant is a separate discussion. That maybe he's talking about a case where Beis Din has no power whatsoever to even hear the case. I don't know. But certainly, at the very least, what the Maharsham stood for is that if the Beis Din doesn't have the ability to enforce the judgment, because they can only say, yeah, Reuven owes Shimon the money, but then in terms of making Reuven pay the money, so that's why you need Shotrim Titen, go to court and have the court enforce the judgment. What people take out of the Maharsham, what Mordechai Eliyahu wrote in a Tchumen article, is that he thinks that if it's a chov boror, where there's no contest whatsoever about the fact that the money is owing, you don't even need to get ahead to Beis Din in the first place. It's questionable how extensively we would apply that, because sometimes what's a chov boror to the plaintiff is not necessarily a chov boror to the defendant. So I don't know how sweeping a dispensation this is, but it comes up. It comes up in various cases of unpaid debts that are evidenced by promissory notes. Schools that want to hire collection agencies to collect unpaid tuition, things of that sort. So let's assume it's a chov boror where there would be some sort of a heter. A second scenario would be where the Beis Din simply gave a heter or cost because the Tovea had summoned the Nitba to come to Beis Din. The Nitba didn't comply, and the Beis Din said to the Tovea that we're going to give you a heter or cost, that you have the right to pursue your case in a court and collect the judgment in court, and then the court issues a judgment, and they also provide, or they also impose statutory interest. The third possible scenario is enforcing a decision of the Beis Din. The Beis Din actually heard a case, they paskined on the case, they said Reuven owes Shimon a certain amount of money, and what do you know? Reuven doesn't pay up. So the Beis Din says to Shimon, you have the right to go to court in order to enforce the Beis Din judgment. There are many poskim, Marshach, and the Shlomo Kluger, and the Imre Bina, a whole long line of poskim who have said even if Beis Din doesn't say explicitly to Shimon, you can go to court to enforce a judgment. It's implied, of course. Shimon can go to court to enforce the Bezdin's judgment. That's the whole purpose of there being a enforcement system of signing a shtar beruin, so that there will be the possibility of the enforcement of the judgment. A question as to whether this is included in the lashon of what the Shulchan Aruch has in Siman Chav Vav or not, but whether or not it's included in this halacha quoted in the name of Shrivagon or not, it's a separate question. It's certainly something that the poskim definitely agree can be done, and certainly when there's a heter bezdin explicitly saying to Shimon, go and enforce the decision that we paskin that Reuben owes you money, and now the court imposes the statutory interest. So, question. In this specific case, let's say Shimon is going to court and collecting the money, chol bavar, heterakos, enforcing Bezdin judgment. Is Shimon allowed to collect this amount? And if Shimon is not really allowed to collect this amount, why is it that Batei Din, because I know Batei Din, we deal with Batei Din all the time, Batei Din never seem to say, not in their rules and procedures, not in their conversations with the claimants, not in any kind of document of a heterokos that might be issued. Oh, and by the way, when you go to court, make sure that you're not going to collect any statutory interest. Make sure that you turn down the statutory interest or you disgorge the statutory interest. So why is it that the Batei Din don't do that if in fact this might be a problem? So we can examine the potential heter, if there is one, of collecting statutory interest through four different angles. One is, and I'm not making up any of these different studim, this is all based on prior discussions, but I collected all of the different discussions of heter, and I was very proud of myself. I collect, this svara, that svara, the other svara. And then late last night, I'm just like trying to look up something else, and I happen upon some decision of the Bezdin Hagadol Leruin from Shnas Tafshin Ayin Ches that has a very lengthy and extensive discussion of all these issues, and they touched upon all of these different svaros. So I felt, oh great, I was preempted, so to speak. So I can't claim, that I was the one who discovered, this particular Chaburah per se. On the other hand, I can say Baruch Shekivanti. So they basically are broken down as follows. The first three are all in this decision from the Bezdin Hagadol, which is a curious decision in certain ways. And the fourth one, they still didn't get at, so I can still take credit for the fourth one. So the first one is collection based on unjust enrichment. That it was unjust, that Shimon didn't pay what he was supposed to pay, and all this time has passed when Reuven could have been using this money. And essentially it's a situation of mevatel kiso shel chavero. You'll say mevatel kiso shel chavero is potter. Okay, fine, we'll get to that. Second, it could be a svara based on, it's a collection based on a knas. That we know that sometimes ribbis is permitted if it's in a fashion of knas, that's in Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin. That it depends, certain circumstances. Is it hova? Is it not a hova? Is it one time? Is it ribbis hamisrabe? Okay, so under certain circumstances, sometimes a knas can be imposed. Number three, this is a very interesting one. This was the first one that was discussed by the Bezdin Hagadol in Netanya. They discussed it first because they wanted dispatch of this one. They didn't like this one. Others say that this is like the best one, but they didn't like it. Okay, fine. And that is that it's possible that if you collect money from somebody, even if you call it ribbis, like I stop somebody in the street, I take out a gun, okay, and I point the gun to the person and I say, pull out your wallet and give me that money because I want it as ribbis. So the person hands over the money. So did I just collect ribbis? No, I called it ribbis, but basically it's highway robbery. I just mugged the person, I took the money, I called it ribbis. So who cares if the court calls its statutory interest, what basically is robbery? They have no right to collect this money. It's basically against the will of this individual who's paying the money. So if it's Baal Korcho against the will of the individual, so maybe by definition, it's not considered to be ribbis. You're not supposed to collect gezel, but maybe it's easier to get out of gezel than it is to get out of ribbis, possibly, okay? And then the fourth side, which was my own innovation, but it's, again, But I suppose the reason it wasn't discussed in this psak din is because it's a bit of a stretch, because it depends on circumstances. Depends on circumstances is the possibility that in certain cases it might be permitted actually to collect an additional amount, if you call it ribbis, because if the person in question really owes the extra money for some other reason, so then if the only way that you, the creditor, can collect this extra money that you're really owed, because the person really stole extra money from you or whatever, is for you to structure it as a ribbis or call it statutory interest or something like that, it still is permitted based on the svara. And this is one of my favorite svaras in Hilchos Ribbis, because I view this as like the foundation stone of all of Hilchos Ribbis. I mean, everybody has their own foundation stone, I suppose, of how they look at Ribbis, is if it's a situation of mishalohu notel. The person is really just taking back that which is really his. Taking back that which is really his, that's the whole heter as to why you can collect money if you rent out items and it's not considered to be ribbis, because you're collecting from something that belongs to you. So too, there might be a svara that if the extra amount really belongs to you anyway, so mishalohu notel, so that could be permissible. Like you have a case, you really owed $1,000, and the court's only going to allow you to collect $800. The Beis Din issued a judgment saying that Reuven owes Shimon $1,000. But because of public policy or whatever the statutes are, the court is only going to recognize $800 of that judgment. So Shimon goes to court, and Shimon says, okay, I want the $800 plus, court costs, statutory interest, or whatever the court's going to give me. And the court decides on their own, they're going to give the $800, and statutory interest comes out to another $200. So Shimon is really just getting the $1,000 that the Beis Din said that Reuven owes him. Who cares if they called it statutory interest? That's the fourth possible head. Okay, so let's go one by one with respect to these different svaras. Now, in the Divrei Gonim, if you look in the Divrei Gonim Sefer, this was, by the way, one of the favorite svarim of Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz, Zekat Tzadik Levacha. He really loved the Divrei Gonim, quoted all the time, in terms of just Beis Din Psakim. This is what we do, this is the halakha. The very first paragraph in the Divrei Gonim on the subject of Ribbis, it's in alphabetical order. It says Cloud Sadi Gimel. So it talks about this case. Echad Tavis Chaver Shishalom Lo Demei Mekach Oskius Ukadome. We have Reuven that goes after Shimon. Okay, we'll switch it. We'll make it Reuven. The Tovei Reuven goes after Shimon, and he asks for Demei Mekach. He's owed money for a purchase transaction, or skiris, or rental transaction, or unpaid wages for work. Ukadome Shelo Ba'idei Liana Nitba B'Toras Hava. Not a Hava situation. Hava, we know, Hava is going to be trickier if it was started out as a loan. V'sirev HaNitba Leilach L'Din Torah. And the Nitba refuses to go to Din Torah. V'zacha Tovea Be'arkos Es HaTviyah. And the Tovea collects the judgment in the civil court. This is a case where it's a heterokos case. It's a heterokos case, not where the Beis Din already issued a judgment, but a heterokos that Shimon refused to go to Beis Din in the first place, so therefore there was a heterokos. And the court ruled that Reuven is entitled to collect his the unpaid wages, whatever it is, or the unpaid price for the transaction, in 6%, at a 6% rate. 6% rent rate, kenog b'ni musam, as is their general rule. Is he also likach mishumisa ribbis, allowed to collect it or not? And he quotes a Shol Meshiv. Shol Meshiv, Madura Basra, Chelik Dalad, Siman Kofchov Gimel, Te'ein Bazeh Mishum Ribbis, Kiven She'ein De'eno Ba Mikoach Hava. Since this amount was being collected not to a Hava, not to a loan transaction, therefore it's not a problem of Ribbis. So he relies upon the Shoel U Meshiv. And the Shoel Meshiv, that's why I started in the materials first source, is the Shoel Meshiv. The general rule, the general question as to whether you can ever collect statutory interest. He's speaking, the Shoel Meshiv speaks about a very specific case, and the Divrei Gonim generalizes and applies it to every single case as long as the obligation did not come from a loan transaction. The case of the Shoel Meshiv was a barter transaction of some sort, switching, they're trading coins, this one gives this one coins, the other one's supposed to give the other one coins. Reuven gives Shimon his coins, and Shimon fails to provide the matbeos, silver coins, whatever they are. he fails to provide the coins to Reuven. Fails to provide him with the coins. So Reuven, in this case, Reuven summons Shimon Ledin, and the Sholem Eshiv, sure enough, says that it would be permissible under these circumstances. What is he relying upon? Which rationale is it that he's relying upon to say that this would be permissible? He says basically the rationale of mevato kiso shel chavero. So as we said, mevato kiso shel chavero, meaning that you're holding somebody's wallet hostage so they can't use their funds and make the money off their funds. So the Yerushalmi says mevato kiso shel chavero is potter. And the Bavli doesn't argue, so why would that be a reason for Reuven to be entitled to collect this amount? Let's say we're not going to call it Ribbis, we're going to call it a premium for Mevato Bechiso Shel Chavero. The Yerushalmi does indicate that there are certain cases where a person might be chayav, like for example when somebody took a field of their fellow away and they sort of held the field hostage and didn't work on the field, and the field therefore didn't yield the normal amount of fruits and crops that it would have yielded, that there would be a chiyuv. But the way we would understand such a chiyuv, if there is one, would be based on the svar that the Nemuka Yosef provides, that we assume that if a person takes a field from somebody else, there's an implied condition they're supposed to work on the field, and if they're not going to work on the field, as an aris, if they're not going to work on the field, so then there is sort of a condition, im la'over, ashalim b'meitva, if I'm not going to work on the field, then I will pay according to the yield that was expected from the field. And since this is something that would typically be an enforceable contract, because in the normal course, in the normal course, the field would yield that amount of fruit. So then that would be okay. But that's only because there was an explicit condition. Here there was no explicit condition, and if there was one, it would sound a little bit like Ribbis. But he said, no, there's a psak of the Ramah. What does the Ramah say? The Ramah says in Siman Reish Sadi Beis Siv Zayin, this is based on a Mordechai. The Mordechai is based on a Rav Yona, that in the event that, let's say, there was a pikadon of money that Reuven left with Shimon, and at a certain point in time, Reuven came to pick up the pikadon. He said, it's time for me to have the pikadon. Tainli pikdoni v'ani aviach behem be'atzmi, and I want to make profit off the pikadon. And Shimon says, nothing doing. I'm not giving you your pikadon. V'hala me'ake biyado. Shimon holds on to the pikadon. Chayiv litain revach mikan alaba. So then Shimon is obligated to pay revach, is obligated to pay whatever profits Shimon realizes from the money from this pikadon going forward, and that, according to the Ramah, is not a problem. Not only that, but in the event that, let's say, Shimon on his own decided that he's going to use the pikadon to make profits, the Sma says that from the lashon of the Ramah that says ein sarach laseis min harevach, if there was no explicit request by Reuven to get the pikadon back, that in those circumstances Shimon doesn't have to pay him from the profits. Nonetheless, if Shimon wanted to, he could, because this wasn't in the context of a halva transaction. But certainly, in a case where Reuven asked explicitly for the funds back because he wanted to make profit, and Shimon didn't do it, and then Shimon made profit, so then he would have to pay over either all the profits or half of the profits. If we're going to view this as like some sort of an implied iska transaction, he would have to pay over profits to Reuven under those circumstances, according to the psak of the Ramah, and therefore it says the Sholem Eshiv, this is the same situation. Of course, you can ask on the psak of the Ramah, isn't Shimon in this particular case a gazlan? If Shimon is a gazlan, so then we have a principle called gazlan mishaman k'shas gzela, that a gazlan only pays according to what an item was worth at the time. That's called kinyan zela, at the time that the gazlan stole the funds. So why does he have to give over some of the revach? So Ksam Sofer gives an answer, and he has a famous tshuva on this general concept of when we would ever apply a chiyuv, mavato kiso shel chavero, how do we understand this Ramah, and so forth. It's in Choshim Mishpat Siman Kuf Ayin Ches, And the Chassam Sofer says, no, it's different because the Nifka didn't intend to steal the entirety of the Pikadon. He understood the Pikadon is supposed to be returned at some point to Reuven. He just wanted to steal the Revach. So since he didn't intend to steal the Keren, so therefore we say that the profits should still be shared. And others give a different explanation, and this you find in the Mordechai, and the Chassam Sofer at the end of his tshuva gives this alternative explanation. He says that we assume, unless Reuven's prepared to accept a chayrim upon himself or take a Shaburah, whatever, that when he invested, that of course he wouldn't be a Gazlan, that he would invested the funds. So with the explanation that it was going to be for the Mafkid's benefit, or like for as an Iska, 50-50 benefit. Although, if you look at the Sholem Eshiv, it's not what the Sholem Eshiv says. The Sholem Eshiv says, no, that Havi Leki Gazlan, that in the event that the money was supposed to be paid, namely the Reuven in this case was going after Shimon for unpaid matbeos, and Shimon refused to go to Bezdin, and therefore Reuven had the right to go to the Arkos, and more time elapsed before he was able to collect the money. So since a lot of time elapsed, so the Shimon is considered to be like a Gazlan, and therefore any extra money that Reuven receives for lost time, lost profits, Menias Harevach, during this period of time, is considered to be a permissible application of the ruling of the Ramah. Now, this is only, number one, if we're dealing with a situation, as the Divrei Gonim said, that the original obligation was not a Hava obligation. If it was a Hava obligation, so then Pashtus is that this heter would not be applicable, and that's what the Shach says explicitly in Siman Pei Aleph, but there are a few other problems. Let's just detail the problems, and then we'll see if there are any problems that we haven't detailed that are left over. So one problem is that the Ramah, actually, if you look at the wording of the Ramah was only Mekel in the event that there actually was Revach. This is the problem that I assumed that Ike was going to point out, that the base Yitzchak notes. Rav Yitzchak Shmelke says the whole thing is just mind-boggling, because how could you possibly derive a heter from this ruling of the Ramah when the Ramah was only talking about a situation of Herviach? So therefore he says that is, number one, already a very difficult aspect of the ruling of the Sholem Eshiv. Adover Tamua, the Sham Davka Beheviach, Kimavua Lashon Ramah, Shama Tainli Piktoni, Chayvli Taina Revach, Abba Below Heviach, Vaday Potter. That's your classic case of, you could say that if Shimon took funds, so Ein Hala Oses Skoraso Beparaso, Ein Hala Oses Skora Beparaso Shel Chavero, like the Maharash Halevi uses that lashon that Shimon had no right to do business and make a profit off of business with Reuven's money. So then, okay, maybe I understand the svara that he's handing over the money in that situation. However, if there is no actual havacha, nidon nidei miyoma sheheviach, v'im lo heviach, have a ribbis. And if there is no actual money that was stolen, that was taken, so then we're just talking about plain, ordinary garden variety ribbis that should be usher. So it happens that the Mordechai himself arguably was more mekel in terms of he wasn't talking about going to court. Mordechai was talking about when the mafkid would be allowed to collect damages from the nifkad who doesn't give over the money. So the Mordechai goes on for a little while, and he quotes various things, which he ultimately interprets as talking about, like Rav Haigon, only a situation where Mamash Sheviach, but the Mordechai himself was quoting from the Rav Yona. So it's a nice 102-page article by Professor Nathan Rackover in the Shari Tzedek Journal, Chelik Gimel, and it's a very nice summary of a lot of these different dinim, although it's sort of a stream of consciousness. But in the course of Rackover's presentation, he spends a lot of time going through the original version of the Rav Yona, in which he shows that the Rav Yona, it seems, was prepared to be more mekel than however he was ultimately quoted by the Mordechai and the Ramah, even in a case where there was a Rebach Boror, where it was very clear that there was going to be a revach, that there was going to be a profit, then maybe you'd be able to collect even in that situation. However, even if one is not relying upon the original source of the Rav Yah quoted by Nachum Rackover, or his interpretation thereof, the truth of the matter is that there is somebody who is more authoritative from later generations, an Achron, who says the same thing, and that's the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer in his tshuva seems to go with this approach, and he says that if I was in fact dealing with a revach boror, so then he quotes from the sugya in Baba Metzia regarding somebody who was supposed to go and purchase a wine in a particular case and he didn't do it, where Rav Chama said that he's obligated for damages. That's the person who is Ada Azul, Parbasa, the Zal Shafat case. And Rav Ashi said, no, that's only an asmachta. So he says, if it wouldn't be an asmachta, if it would be revach boror, so even Rav Ashi would agree with Rav Chama, and there's a ritva, that the obligation has something to do with an areb, that once the person is being relied upon, so he takes upon an obligation of an areb. So the Chassam Sofer seems to suggest of that possibility, but again, that seems to be going a little bit out into left field, because Pashtus is it's not what the Ramah says, and certainly if you want to justify the collection of a statutory interest, it becomes much more difficult to justify it on that basis. Number two, it seems to only apply when the nifkad was told explicitly by the mafkid, oh, you know what, I want my funds in order to be able to make money. We don't know that in every single case where somebody is going to court to collect statutory interest that there was this discussion, oh, please give me the money that you owe me because I want to use the money in order to generate a profit. Maybe it's a good idea that the claimant should say that to the respondent should say, oh, I need the money right away because I need to make money, I need to make a profit off of it, so then it might be something to discuss. But even then, you would still have the first objection, which is if there was a clear profit that was made from this actual money, then it's very hard to use the Ramah as a precedent. But then, the third objection, which is maybe equally difficult as the first objection to overcome, is that not everybody agrees with the Ramah. Halakha l'maisa, we have a shach. The shach is certainly a very preeminent last word authority when it comes to any ruling in Choshen Mishpah, and the shach quotes the Maharshal. The Maharshal says explicitly that even in a case where the mafkid had said to the nifkad, I want the money and I want to be able to make profit off of the money, and then even profit was made off of the money, nonetheless, says the Maharshal, that it should not be collected. Why should it not be collected? Because he says, Afilu Tova L'Din, V'amalo Tainli Pikdonin Ki Yeshi Revach Boror, Umevared Dvarav, V'zem Me'akvo, Patur D'Mevato Kiso Lo Havi El Groma. He says that at the end of the day, it's only considered to be groma if a person's mevato kiso, even if it's shown that money could have been made, money was made, it doesn't really make a difference. The Nachlas Tzvi, which is a parish in the Shulchan Aruch that was written by the same individual who authored the Piskei Tshuva, the Nachlas Tzvi says that one is allowed to say Kimli, like the Maharshal. The Chassam Sofer was not so thrilled with this Maharshal, and I don't know, the Piskei Tshuva did have access to most of the Chassam Sofer's Tshuvos, that he usually included the ones he didn't have in his first printing in brackets that he included later on, but hard to say he didn't have access to this particular tshuva. He certainly didn't seem to ever change his mind. The Chazon Ish does note, and this is just worth noting in terms of how one reads a shach. The shach simply quoted the Maharshal. He said V'rashal pasuk. So I think most of us would assume that if the shach just quotes the Maharshal without further comment, he's on some level endorsing the Maharshal. So Chazon Ish says not necessarily. He's quoting the Maharshal. He's letting you know that there's a Maharshal out there. Mashihiskir hashach ena mevuar ta'af she'hashach hevi divrei Maharshal lo kased la'askim imo. He didn't say, and by the way, I agree with the Maharshal. Do we require that? Do we require that of the shach in general? That he has to say, oh, and by the way, and I agree, v'nirim dvarav. Is that, I don't know. I'm not sure. He said, but this is the Chazon Ish speaking. So he says, no, you can't just assume. The shach assumed the Maharshal. Aval ein kan mokum lo hakim li k'Maharshal. He says he doesn't agree with the Nachlas Tzvi that you can say Kimli Kamarshal Neged Agaonim Shevi Mordechai. Given the Mordechai brings Rav Haigon, he brings the Rav Yona, he's bringing important authorities. He said, I don't think that it's so pashut that you can just say Kimli in this particular case, like the Maharshal, to not require the payment of the money, like the Shita of the Ramah. So that's kind of interesting. That comment is particularly interesting when we're dealing with our Shiloh. Because our Shiloh is not a Shiloh of whether we the Bezdin, are going to be Mechayev the Mammon. I think that as a general rule, even the Shoel Meshiv doesn't have a Havamina that a Bezdin is going to be Mechayev this Mammon. The question is it simply legitimate when the person collects his money in court? So if the person is collecting the money in court, so then it becomes more of a question of how strong is the Shita of the Maharshal. Is the Shita of the Maharshal so strong that we're now going to extract the money from the individual? So here you can already take into account the Chazon Ish say, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure you could have said Kimli in the first place. Certainly to take the money away is not a slam dunk. On the other hand, I had to get around the problem that we're not dealing with a situation where there clearly was Revach a little bit harder unless you say that, okay, we're going to follow the principle of the Chassam Sofer. If it was a Revach Bar, is every single case a Revach Bar? Chassam Sofer said there are certain cases that are a Revach Bar, like the case of Sadeh. But I don't know that you can say with respect to every single case that's a Revach Bar. Usually, the statutory interest that's imposed is not identical to the interest that you would be able to collect if you put the money in a savings account in the bank. The interest that you get nowadays, putting money in a savings account in a bank, you'd have to put a lot of money for a really long time to get any discernible return whatsoever. Usually the statutory interest is more significant than that. It's very difficult to say that we're talking about the category of Revach Bar. It would have to be a much lower threshold in order to be in the category of Revach Bar. But once you are...
You say that the investing in the money market is Revach Bar?
Might be Revach Bar for pennies.
No,
pennies.
In the money market you can make 4.5% right now.
In a money market bank account, savings bank account, you can make 4.5 now.
Depends which financial institution you're in.
Okay, so we'd have to say...
In theory, if it's not FDIC insured...
4.5 a year?
Yeah.
Oh no! If it's not FDIC insured, so it may not be so. So I don't know that's
the only risk is if the financial institution goes bankrupt.
But that happens.
Yes, exactly. But it doesn't.
That happens.
Nobody actually thinks, for example, that Merrill Lynch is going. I'm not sure that nobody operates with the assumption that Merrill Lynch is going to go bankrupt because
I don't know. J.P. Morgan almost went bankrupt a few years ago. I don't know. I don't think it's Revach Bar. I'm not sure it's Revach Bar. I'm not sure.
But okay. That happens once in 100 years, and that's why it's a news article, right?
It happens more than once in 100 years. It might happen once every 10 years. I don't know.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
5-year CD is FDIC insured and it's 4 or 5%.
Okay, so that sort of thing maybe you can use. Maybe
it's 9%.
Get it.
New York State statutory interest is 9%.
Yeah, the statutory interest is 9%, but the amount that you could get is 4 or 5%, assuming that you keep it there for 5 years, which is also not so pashut. Who says that the person is going to want to tie up their money for 4 or 5 years?
Even 10 months is like 4%, but still.
Okay, but certainly less than the statutory interest. Okay, whatever the amount, it's less than the statutory. The statutory interest is more than whatever the amount is. That's naniach. We don't have to nitpick about what the amounts are. Now, if you are relying upon this psak of the Ramah, so then the question is, why is it so pashut that it would not include hava? And in fact, it's not so pashut to everybody because the Sma says otherwise. Well, the Sma seems to say otherwise. Very strange Sma. In Siman Pei Aleph. If you look at the halacha there, in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Pei Aleph, Sif Lamed Beis, Ruvain Tava L'Shimon Revach, Achov Shahay Olav Mikam Hashanim. Our case, right? Ruvain is saying, I want to collect the money, Chol Bar, whatever, from Shimon, you owe me for many years, and he says that you promise you're going to give me Revach, whatever, and Shimon says, nothing doing. I didn't promise you anything of that sort. So we say that Shimon is part of Afilu Mishvua, etc. Says the Shema, Ayin l'kaman Siman Reish Tzadi Beis. Tim Tava Ruvain Ma'osav She'abiyak Ben Muma'akman Biyadav Shechayev Lo Revach Mikana La'ala. He says, why in the world is Shimon Potter when Ruvain's saying, I want the money back? Okay, so the money that Shimon may have made in the past obviously belongs to Shimon. But Ruvain is saying, I want the money that you owe me right now, and because I want to make Revach, and so Mikana La'aba, at least Shimon should be obligated to pay him the money. So he says, I'll give you two answers. I'll give you two answers as to why Shimon's not obligated to give him the money. Number one, we're talking about when it wasn't time yet for Shimon to pay back the money. Number two, another possibility is that Reuven never asked for the money back. He's asking, so he says that since he never asked for the money back, so we're not able to trigger a new obligation where the money has now been converted, that it's been converted into some sort of a pikadon, for which there's going to be an obligation going forward, and therefore that's why Shimon is off the hook. So the Shach says, why do you have to come up with these far-fetched reasons? I can give you a better reason why Shimon is off the hook. In Simon Reish Pei Beis, we're talking about a situation, we're talking about a situation where there was a pikadon, where there isn't an intrinsic Ribbis problem to share profits from a pikadon, to give away profits that Shimon is making from Reuven's pikadon. However, here where was a halva that was owed, we're talking about Hilchos halva, that was owed by Shimon to Reuven, so then for sure it would be a problem. The Shach does not say the words. And you know what the problem would be? The problem would be Ribbis. However, while I can't put words into the Shach's mouth, the Aruch HaShulchan is certainly entitled to put words into the Shach's mouth. So the Aruch HaShulchan quotes the Shach, and the Aruch HaShulchan says, yeah, it's very, very clear that the case there in Simon Reish Tzadi Beis was talking about pikadon, that there you can obligate Shimon for the monies that he's going to make at that point in time. However, when it comes to the halva, you can't be mechayev him. Why? Mishum ribbis, because it's going to be a ribbis problem, and that is sort of a very straightforward and would seem to be a pretty clear cut. And you figure that the Aruch HaShulchan himself said that, so he would be the last possible person to go against himself, but he does. Because the Aruch HaShulchan in Simon Reish Tzadi Beis, when he's describing these halachas, he says, this halacha of the Ramah, does it apply only to pikadon, or does it apply to halva as well? And he says, well, I would think that it only applies to pikadon, and he gives you a reason for the chiyuv. He says this is worse than mevatel kiso shel chaver, because it's an actual profit that's made, and therefore it's not just grama, it's garmi. It's actual garmi, kiman she'viach behem. Okay, v'lo garim misada, shechayev k'shebitla, like the case of the Sada, even the Yerushalmi, that articulates the din of Mevatel Kiso Shel Chaver, says in the case of Sada, you have to pay, okay, because there's clear cut the damage that was caused, fine, we understand that. Then he says, in Simon Pei Aleph, in the case of Hava, we don't have this din, so you can say that maybe Hava is different because it's Nitan L'Hotzah, evocations of Ribbis, but then he says, at the end, I have a hard time with this. He says, V'nira Ika Kedei Rishona, that the day Rishona, that really the din would apply even to halva. It would apply even to halva, as the Sma indicated. The Sma indicated would apply to halva, and in that case it didn't apply only because the time didn't come to collect, or the Tovei never asked for the money. Because after all, if the Lova has the money, he's obligated to give it over, and therefore it's doma lepikadon. Only if he didn't have it, it's not like a pikadon. So therefore he says it's like a pikadon, even though it started out as halva. So how in the world do you understand the Aruch HaShulchan? Very, very difficult. The only pshat I can come up with is that he's not really contradicting himself. He's saying if it really is characterized as a halva, so of course taking additional money is going to be ribbis. But if it converts from a halva into a pikadon, so then it's a totally different story. It's like I have an object that I loan out to somebody, that Mashio, the person's a shoah, but then at the point in time that we agreed, we stipulated he's going to return it on a particular time, he doesn't return it at a particular time, so he turns from a shoah into a shomer at that point in time. So you can say the same thing, that the halva, if it's converted to a pikadon at this particular point in time, is not necessarily a contradiction. But it's not generally assumed that that would be correct, and the general assumption of all of the poskim, the Mases Binyamin, in Siman Lamed Daled, the Shus Yaakov that I have in the materials, they all are very, very strong that the heter, if there is one, to whatever degree, you would accept the heter of the Ramah, or the psak of the Ramah, and not be worried about the Maharshal, whether L'chatzkila or B'diavad. It would only apply to Pikadon cases and not to L'chatzkila cases, and the Shus Yaakov is very strong language. If anybody would say otherwise, and he does not only reserve his strong language for the Asma, but he is equally agitated about the Shach, because the Shach didn't do what the Aruch HaShulchan did. The The Aruch HaShulchan added a couple of words. The Aruch HaShulchan said, yeah, that would be kind of problematic because, we have this thing known as Ribbis. But the Shach didn't really do that. The Shach just said, oh yeah, the Sma had a couple of good reasons. That maybe the time didn't come to collect the loan yet. Maybe he didn't ask for it altogether. Oh, and maybe you could also I can add a third pasta. Those are good. Those are good. Those are good answers by the Sma. But I can come up with a third one too. Then maybe there's like some reason. I don't know what. But maybe there's some reason we should distinguish between Pikadon and Halva. And it's just what's going on over here. First of all, those two reasons of the Sma don't wash it all. The only reason is the third reason, and explain the reason for your explanation that it's a problem of Ribbis. So he says, "Shach kasav v'zel l'shonim v'od yeshlom the hosam ma'iri pikadim v'kam be'ova ikan l'shonim v'tama kra al Sma ve'ashach shekasav rak b'derech od yeshlom teich all al daitam lahatir Ribbis kehai devada in lahatir schar ikum ma'osav al hosam pikadim dafkam v'lo be'habad lo son in devada davi Ribbis." Ribbis. He says, yeah, Hova, nothing to discuss. So Shikaago gets very worked up over this, and I think is sort of the general assumption of most of the posts. And what if you decided in the Hova case, okay, fine, but the person lost out on having the funds for this period of time, so fine, the Bezdin is not going to be Makai of him, but the Nifka, or in this case, the Love, just feels bad, I was holding up his money all this time, and he could have really made money with this, and it's sort of like the cost of living, that things are more expensive now, and he's lost out because now it's going to cost him more money to buy orange juice than if he would have had the money, a couple of weeks earlier, so I'll pay him the difference on my own. So, Al Pi Pashtus, that's a problem, because volunteering a Ribbis payment is also a problem. Even if it wasn't a Ketitza, it's certainly a problem on a D'Rabbanan level. Just comes along with Shlomo Zalman and says, no, I'm okay with that. That's fine. That's fine. I don't understand the shiur of Shlomo Zalman, but Shlomo Zalman says it, and you can maybe take this into account. Again, in a statutory interest case, this isn't what's going on. Nobody's making a voluntary payment, although we'll come up with a case soon where maybe they are. But he says, let's say I have a case of this sort. This is in the Mincha Shlomo, Chelik Aleph. If it's not Chelik Aleph, you could say, well, we don't understand the context, whatever, it's Paslamis, or who knows what he really meant. But this is in Chelik Aleph, Simen Chav Zayin, Kam Choshveni, Shimalovi is Naik Shlo Kedin, Valifoa Chova Rak Le'achazman. Lova was really holding up the money. The Vali Chayav Alova, the Fayas is a Malveh. He certainly should appease the Malveh. He was holding up his money, and Shemishalim Ra Tachas Tova, Veloparis Achob Bismano. It's not so nice. So it's true, okay, well, soon the Malva can go after him, but then Mustabish, Lova Atzlim, Vosalassis, De Shemaim, Shapim, Mutalo, Laistain, Mammon, the Malva, Levadla said, Taromashish, Lola, the Malva shouldn't be angry at him. Let him give him some extra money. That's okay. So he says that since the money is not being given as Ribbis, but on the Iku Piron, Shalova, Neged, Ratson, Malva, so he says, Kiman Shkane, Efsha, the Shapim, Mutal, the Paiso, Bimamon, Apilu, Imapiu, Su, the Pichishub, Shal Ribbis. So then he uses a lashon which you would think is a little improvident. He says you can even cheshbon out how much the lov is going to volunteer based on the chishuv shel Ribbis, and he bases himself on the case of the Eidim Zomim, Mishnah Makos, Daf Gimel, where Eidim Zomim say that this fellow was obligated to pay back an amount within 30 days. Really, it was supposed to be within 10 years. And therefore they have to pay the difference of what a person could have made with their money, or what they would give to have the money for the additional time of the difference between 30 days and 10 years. Mincha Shlomo was not the first person to bring this case of Eidim Zomim for dinim of this sort, as we'll see in a second. But he kind of makes it seem as if he was the one who discovered this makar, and he says since it would be okay under those circumstances, so therefore it would be okay as the chishuv shel Ribbis. Now there are those who say that it can't be that this is what Rosh Shlomo Zalman meant to say that it would be the chishuv shel Ribbis, because that really doesn't sound very good at all. So I did see in the Sefer Nesiva Shalom, where he quotes this particular heter of Rosh Shlomo Zalman, and he reinterprets it. Now, the problem is, he's reinterpreting based on a shmua of what he heard from Rosh Shlomo Zalman. He says, I heard from Rosh Shlomo Zalman, and it can't be that Rosh Shlomo Zalman meant that you're going to do it the chishuv shel Ribbis. You see, the problem with that interpretation of Shlomo Zalman is that Shlomo Zalman kind of ruined it for him because he wrote the words, the Kishuv Shel Ribbis. So I don't know what to do with that. But I'll tell you what, he wrote at least to explain Shlomo Zalman. He said, V'shamanu, this is in Siman Kuf Ayin, in Os Lamed Beis. And then Nesiva Shalom, he says, V'shamanu, Ve'agon Shlomo Zalman Oibach, Lahatir Zos, namely Lahatir the Love Habal L'Shalim Atzmo Nizikim Shenigramu Lemalve, even in terms of the amount of money that was lost that the person could have made in the meantime. The price of orange juice went up in the meantime. But of course, he wouldn't have meant to go beyond that. Obviously, Rosh Shlomo Zalman was aser al love litain pitzui avur minias revachim shenigrim olamalba ekev ikun apiron. Obviously, he wasn't compensating him for the loss of profit that he could have made. He's having mamish ribbis, because that's obviously ribbis. Obviously, that's not what he meant. So I leave it to you to determine what the words mean. Afilu imapius tu l'hishuv shel ribbis within the wording of Rosh Shlomo Zalman. I don't know. Let's say that he meant what the Nesiva Shalom meant, but other wording probably would have gotten the point over a little bit more clearly, perhaps. Okay. That being said, that would only be relevant, of course, if the person was volunteering the money. But here we're talking about where it's being required to be paid by the court, and it becomes much more difficult to rely upon this svara. Number one, there wasn't clear revach over here. And number two, if I had a halva case, so I certainly would seem to be up the creek. Again, the Sholem Meishiv's case was not a halva case, and we'll assume that most cases are not halva cases. But let's say, though, that you had a bezdin that would want to rely upon this and not worry about the marashal. So do the Bate Din distinguish between cases where they're giving a heter or kos, where the person is looking to create a loan or to collect a loan, as opposed to where a person is looking to collect some other type of debt? Does anybody pay any attention to these distinctions? Not entirely clear to me. In fact, but the Sholem Meishiv himself seems to go beyond the sources that he cited in not sort of requiring an outright revach. So we have to just see, is there a way of reviving some type of an explanation, a justification for the Sholem Meishiv going sort of beyond the Ramah. So one possibility, which is raised by the Beis Yitzchak, by Yitzchak Shmelkes, some source of Chabes and Yerodea, Chelik Beis Siman Aleph, is maybe what he had in mind was the sort of this idea of the Pseida D'Shukah. Pseida D'Shukah, what's Pseida D'Shukah? There were takanos. There were takanos made to allow certain things for creditors to collect, even though it wasn't so squeaky clean, let's say, at least on a D'Rabbanan level, but, you can remake it maybe on D'Rabbanans, as long as we're not talking about Ribbis Deraisa, just so that people would be able to feel comfortable transacting business in the marketplace. And if they wouldn't be able to collect certain things, it would be very problematic. So the Beis Hillel, in Siman Kuf Ayin, talks about it. They allowed certain things for Pseida D'Shukah, and the Beis Yitzchak says maybe that's what he's getting at. Maybe that's the idea that we're concerned that we're applying some sort of a Pseida D'Shukah. Ve'im lo hiviach haveribis, achulai kivan. Maybe what the Sholem Meishiv had in mind was the divrei Beis Hillel. Deyesh takana mishum Pseida D'Shukah. What's the Pseida D'Shukah of the takanas Beis Hillel? We like the Beis Hillel. The Beis Hillel was on the Bezdin of the Chilkas Mechokek. I think he lived, 17th century. A lot of things that we do today, we quote the Beis Hillel based on the Beit Hillel. He was a superstar personality. He had a lot of takanos. The way that we interview applicants to want to prove their Jewishness today, that we're a little bit more circumspect of them than the halacha strictly would require. That was also a takanat Beit Hillel that's quoted by the Ber Heitev. The idea that every single establishment or a person who sells food and gets a profit from any food that they make, even if they're an Adam kosher and they're Shomer Shabbos and they wear their tzitzis out and everything else, that we're not going to buy food from any kind of a person who sells food unless they have a proper hashgacha. That's also from the Beit Hillel. A lot of good things from the Beit Hillel. This one, also a nice thing perhaps, but not one that I think necessarily has survived the ages. This was a case of, I have a non-Jew, loans money to a Jewish person. He says, I'm only going to do it if you get yourself a guarantor. Somebody comes along and says, okay, I agree to be your guarantor.
But the way that it's done, we generally assume that Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Ayin says, is that they can go after the guarantor just as easily. They can go after the lover. That's called an Arav Kabbalah. Arav Kabbalah, that's a problem already. It's a problem of Ribbis. It's considered like the Arav Kabbalah borrowed the money, then he loaned the money to the Jew. So if he's going to pay the money to the non-Jew with the Ribbis, then collect the Ribbis from the Jew afterwards, it's going to be a problem of Ribbis. On the other hand, let's say he already had to pay the money. He already had to pay the money. The non-Jew came along and said, I want you to pay the money, and you owe the interest, principal and interest, you got to pay it all. And the Arav Kabbalah, okay, so he pays it all. Now he turns to the lover and he says, I want you to pay me my damages. Not as a ribbis per se, I'm not charging you ribbis, but I lost money. I had to pay not only $500 of principal, I had to pay another $100 of interest. I lost $600. Give me back the $600. So you're allowed to collect the $600. Is the extra $100, not as ribbis, is damages. So you're allowed to collect it as damages. So the Rima Korkea Kaiser says, yes, you can collect it as damages. No problem. This is quoted by the Torah in Siman Kuf Ayin, and the Torah says we don't agree with the Rima Karkaisa. We don't agree with it. The Taz says that basically the nature of their disagreement is premised upon the concern that this might be Ribbis Ketzutza, might be Ribbis Daraisa, because it's a tzad echad b'ribbis. Maybe the non-Jew will go after the Arab, maybe he won't go after the Arab, and then it'll trigger a ribbis problem. So maybe the ribbis problem won't get triggered. So the Beit Hillel holds, the Rima Karkaisa holds, it's ribbis d'Rabbanan. Ribbis d'Rabbanan, avak ribbis. Avak ribbis, if you paid it, you don't have to disgorge it. So in this particular case, it's considered, since there's no, ein mamono, ein lo hanami zev lo nisrabo mimam mamono, since the Arab is not getting any benefit, he's just collecting his damages, so it's considered as if being made whole is as if he already had the money. So it's not like he's taking anything new away, he's just being made whole, and therefore under these circumstances it's considered as if like the equivalent of a avak ribbis that was already collected that doesn't have to be disgorged, so here it can even collect it in the first place. That's the Svara says the Taz, the Rima Karkaisa, and the Torah, who disagrees with him vehemently, and that's how we would assume. Halacha l'maisa assumes that no, this is ribbis deraisa. Tzad echad b'ribbis is also be deraisa, and at least when it happens, then it becomes ribbis ketzutza, so that becomes deraisa, and therefore there's no room to be meko based on avak ribbis considerations. So this comes along the Beit Hillel. The Beit Hillel says, yeah, that's nice. Aval aksha b'doras halalu, he's not working off of the Taz. He must be working with the assumption that the whole thing is only midrabanan, because midaraisa you can't make takanos to do away with the daraisa. It must be he's assuming there's a drabanan. It says they have the gimel aratzos, the dalet aratzos. I forget whether it's 3 or 4, whatever. The minhag of let's call it the dalet aratzos is that minhag b'dinei aratzos livsok fseida deshuka, that we paskin fseida deshuka ve'ein potze per mitzavseif. And nobody's complaining about this, okay? Kedin, hefke, bez, and hefke. We'll go with hefke, bez, and hefke over here. So that does away with all problems. As we know, hefke, bez, and hefke, nobody had the money to begin with. They didn't have the money, it's not ribbis. So don't worry about it, nothing to see here, folks. And therefore, for the sake of just the commercial marketplace, we're going to make this takana sashuk because of Seder Deshukah. So maybe there's an idea of Seder Deshukah, but a couple of problems with that. Number one, it doesn't seem like we paskin like Takana's Beis Hillel. This particular Takana Beis Hillel didn't really make it, and you can understand why he wouldn't make it if we're really dealing with a problem potentially, according to the Taz, of Ribbis Daraisa, and therefore very difficult to say that we would rely upon Pseida Deshuka under these circumstances in order to allow for Ribbis to be collected, or to allow for this extra amount of statutory interest to be collected. He says, especially in the event that there was no actual harbacha, there was no actual extra profit that was made under the circumstances that is being collected. So therefore, he brings that suggestion within the Shoel HaMeshe, but ultimately he rejects that suggestion. He says that in many things we don't follow like the takanos aratzos anyway, so it's very difficult to rely upon that, and therefore the only real time that you could rely upon the psak of the Ramah is in a case of hirviach, And the Yimei Yosher says exactly the same thing, that it only makes sense in the context of Hirviach. So what else then do we have to go on in terms of the Sholem Eishiv's reliance on this particular psak? Well, there's one other thing, and that's the Shita that's quoted in the Tshuvas Maimonius in the Sefer Mishpatim, Tshuva Tezvav, and that is the special heter of Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, or Rabbi Eliezer Mitula, whatever you want to call him, okay? He's the same person. So Rabbi Eliezer Mituch said, I don't know if he said it, or somebody else said it, it's a little bit unclear. According to Tshuvas Maimonius, we give him credit. He's the one who said it. He had a machlokas with his brother, I don't know. But there's a case where there was a malabid, somebody who was supposed to get paid wages. He didn't get paid his wages on time. So do we say that when the employer pays him at a later point in time, that we can impose a manias or revach penalty upon the employer? And he said, yes, you can do it. For a very simple reason you can do it. And why is that? Because there's no ribbis b'schirus. Because ain't schirus mishalemes el b'sof. So when you finally get around to paying the malamid, so that's the only time in which the obligation has been incurred, right? Ma'bin ala schayvin, ma'bin ala mecher, right? So no problem with ribbis with respect to schirus, and therefore it's going to be permissible. And of course, the brother of Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, according to the presentation of the Agos Maimonius, disagreed with him because we have a sugya in the Gemara in Baba Metzia of Hanu Demintari Bagi, on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, in which we see that if the workers weren't working until the very last moment that they got paid, then we don't apply the principle of Ein Skirus Mishlemes Ela B'Sof. Then we say it's really ribbis. The worker stopped working in February, would have got him paid $200, and then you pay him in May $300. Guess what that is? That's ribbis. If he was just knocking on the ground a little bit every single day between February and May, and then got paid the $300 in May, so fine. So that's okay. That's the sugya Baba Metzia of Hanu Demintri Bagi. But otherwise, it's going to be a problem of ribbis. That's what the Beis Yosef quotes Rabbi Eliezer Mitula, and he also rejects it based on this general principle, Yesh Ribbis B'Schirus. So the version of the story in the Rav Yona, or in the Or Zarua, I should say, is that the Or Zarua says Rabbi Eliezer Mitula wasn't the dayan in the case, he was the worker in the case. He was the worker on the case, and he wanted to get paid, and the employer was named Rav Chizkiah, and the dayan was actually the Rav Yona, and the one who disagreed was the Or Zarua. Okay, fine. Whatever your version is, this is the basic inyan. The case of Rabbi Eliezer Mituch and the psak, that maybe in a case where there's no actual ribbis to begin with, so then you would be allowed to collect for minias. You'd be allowed to collect for minias revach. However, the Mishnah Lamelech says that once we assume halacha lemaisa, is the Mishnah Lamelech in Hilchos Mav Lover Perek Zayin halacha Yud Aleph. He says you have to cut through a lot of static to sort of get to the bottom line here of this discussion. There's a lot of static in the discussion, Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, but I think you get to sort of the bottom line of the discussion. So he says, look, since we assume there is ribbis when it comes to schirus, there is ribbis. If a person didn't get paid right away, and you're paying them later on, and an amount of time elapsed between when they stopped working and when you're actually paying them, so we do consider that to be ribbis. Maybe if it wasn't the case where there was an actual judgment that was rendered, or there was an agreement of zakon Allah b'milveh, maybe we won't call it ribbis deraisa, but at least it's going to be ribbis derabbanan. At least it's going to be ribbis derabbanan, like no better than a mecha transaction was going to be ribbis derabbanan under those circumstances. So if we're going to be makel at all, with respect to collecting from Minias Revach, it would have to be based on the parameters that were set forth by the Mordechai, as quoted by the Rav Yona, as codified by the Ramah, where the worker said, I need the money, because I need to make money off of the money, I need to make profits off the money, and then the employer used those funds in order to generate money, so then, kishehirviach with the funds, so then he'd be entitled to ask for it. But if it wasn't a case where it fit all of those parameters, it fit all of those rules, so then we wouldn't be able to rely upon it. And the Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, what was his main proof text? His main proof text was that the Sugya and Makos, which he says, the Sugya and Makos, the Mishnah Makos, can't be talking about a halva because you can't collect extra money for a halva that's based on an extension of time. So it must be that it was talking about a schirus case, and we see that you can collect for Minias Revach, and there were all kinds of ways of slugging up that raya. Maybe kasher zomom is a different sort of standard. Maybe we're talking about how much money would a person have to pay to a non-Jew in order to have money on their hands for an extra 9.5 years, or 9 years, 11 months, and 30 days, and not 9 years and 11 months. The difference between the testimony of the Eidim Zom and the amount of time that they would have had the money. We're not talking about where the money is being generated essentially for Menias HaRevach, but just what's the actual price that a person would have paid to have those funds. But the Bach goes in the opposite direction. The Bach in Siman Kuf Ayin Aleph says, this Rabbi Eliezer Mitoch, not such a bad idea. He had the raya from the Mishnah Makos, the counter raya from Hanu Dimitam Ribagi. We can explain away that it's dafka in the case with Zakman Lav B'Milveh, it's not Zakman Lav B'Milveh, so maybe you could still rely upon the Svara and Skius Mishlemes Elabisov, and therefore in Tafas Lo Mafkinen. That if, let's say, the Socher actually grabbed these extra funds from the maskir, he's not going to have to disgorge it. So you say, so now I have something over here, because even in a case where it wasn't here v'yach, according to the Bach, unless you understand like the Mishnah Melech, but the Bach doesn't incorporate that idea of the Mishnah Melech, so maybe based on Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, there's something to talk about. I don't know why the case of Skivus would be any better than the case of Pigodon. Maybe it's worse. I don't see why it would be any better. Very difficult to rely upon the Bach. And anyway, the Shach put a kabash on the Bach. Was the Shach and Siman Kuf Ayin Vav. It says in all of these types of cases we're dealing with actual Ribbis concerns. Where's the Shach in the materials? This is on source Yud Zayin on page 6. He says that Muvur Kan the Ein Chiluk B'Mos Chivus L'Mos Haba the Olam Kol Aga Not to Lay Asa period of a Lo Kabach, and not what the Bach says in Siman Kuf Samach Al Sif Beis. The Shach says even B'Di'evet you can't rely upon the sheet of the Bach. I think that's how it's generally assumed. Okay, now Sholem Eshiv, we found all kinds of problems with Sholem Eshiv. But Sholem Eshiv wasn't the only one who was asked this question. You know who else was asked this question about the collection of statutory interest, none other than the Avnei Nezer. Avnei Nezer, what was his case? The Avnei Nezer's case was a case where there was an actual psak bezin. It wasn't just a hetero situation like in the Sholem Eshiv's case. There was a psak issued by the bezin that Shimon was supposed to pay Reuven, but he didn't pay up. So now the Reuven was given a heter to collect his money in the Arkos. Is he allowed to collect the statutory interest? I don't understand the word of what the Avnei Nezer says. So how do you expect me to explain to you the Avnei Nezer? Very not fair. So you can read the Avnei Nezer for yourself. You figure it out. But what the Avnei Nezer seems to be saying is that he's also relying upon the Ramah. However, since there is the Maharshal, and he acknowledges he has some distinction at the beginning between Gezel, not Gezel. I don't know, it's voluntary, not voluntary. I don't know. Everything he suggests, he seems to shlug up. So then he gets to the very end, and he says, ultimately, I am relying upon the Ramah, just like the Sholem Eshiv relied upon the Ramah. However, he says, I'm mindful of the Maharshal. So therefore, if you have this type of a situation, so the statutory interest could be collected, but you know what? Do it as a pshara. Do it as a pshara. That to tov the pashir. In this type of situation, the person collects a little bit, but they shouldn't collect the entire amount. They're in court, so what are they going to do? They're going to say that they'll agree that they'll accept a little bit of the money, but they're not going to accept all of the money. Something like that. That's what the Avnei Nezer seems to be suggesting. Look at the very end of the Avnei Nezer, top of page 5. Says, the last paragraph of the Avnei Nezer, Be'emes hashak pasak sham lo krama, ela karashal the dom levato kisel shakavero, v'nei ledas hashak sharosa muskarim, let's say shidei shemaim no more tefisa. So he says you have to take the shak seriously, not like the Chazon Ish, he assumes the shak meant it. V'zeh dom levato kisel shakavero aslu dvom lehotzi v'menu hachamisha pipe medinem, v'chalilo lifsok neged hashak. Shepsakim mekubalim mechor Yisrael. The shak, he was our grand leader. When it comes to a final postek achron of the Shulchan Aruch on some level, mikol makom begonzeh told the pasha minei mishom. So he says, make up shara. Make up shara for what? Now I'm making up shara with respect to the psak bezin. Bezin says that Shimon owes Reuven $1,000. Don't make up shara on the $1,000. That was already paskin. He means the statutory interest. Okay, so don't collect, the full whatever it was, the full $50, the 5%. So collect the $20. Something like that. That seems to be the suggestion of the Avnei Nezer. Now, the question came to the fore around 28 years ago. The following question was sent around to various poskim. It's codified in the journal. I did not include this in the materials, but it's in the Kollel HaTorah journal. The Kollel HaTorah journal, a question was sent to certain poskim, including Shmuel Vosner, and his Shuv is published in the Shevet HaLevi. Chelik Tes Shivin Siman Shintes. It was sent to Rav Yaakov Yeshaya Bloy, author of the Piskei Choshen, more importantly for our purposes, the Bris Yehuda. The Shaila was sent to them and a few other poskim as well. So Shaila, some Malamed was fired by some yeshiva. Somewhere in Europe, wasn't anywhere near us, not New York, not Chicago, far, far, far away, not even Eretz Yisrael, in Europe. Okay, so it was happened in Europe. And then the yeshiva was told that the Bezdin, it was a Zabla, so nobody trusted the Bezdin. But the Bezdin paskin that the yeshiva was obligated to pay a certain amount of pisuyim, damages, compensation, to severance, to the Malamed. But they didn't pay. The yeshiva said it wasn't a fair psak, and we don't think we have to go along with that. And they were fighting and debating and squabbling over this for a good 4 years or so, until finally it made its way into the court. And the court was going to issue a decision in favor of the Malamed that the yeshiva was obligated to pay the amount plus damages, court fees, attorney's fees, whatever, plus statutory interest. And the yeshiva realized this is going to be a phenomenal chilul Hashem. So they said, you know what? In order that this not be headlined all over the newspapers in Europe and so forth, and it looks like a chilul Hashem in the courts and whatever, so we'll just pay whatever amount the court would have been mechayev, including the statutory interest, we're prepared to pay it. And made a settlement. Then afterwards, the heads of the yeshiva looked at each other and said, wait a second, we're not sure that we can really pay this amount, because this is a problem of Ribbis, not so pashut that we can pay this amount. And the Malamed, he's a Malamed, so he's a Rebbe, he's a Talmid Chacham, says, what are you talking about? Sholem Meshiv, I can collect the amount, it's fine, don't worry, no halakhic problem, you can pay me everything, it's wonderful, I agree with you shouldn't make a chilul Hashem, pay me everything, it's statutory, so we'll good, or we'll be forgiven, no problem. So then the question was sent to various poskim. So the first, Rosh Medabrim, was the Dayan in Manchester. I don't know if you've heard of him, but Asher Yaakov Westheim. I don't know. Asher Yaakov Westheim was the Rosh Medabrim, and he said that the case, that even if you hold, like Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, so he pulls out Rabbi Eliezer Mituch, he says that even if you hold like those who are mekel in any non-hova case, the problem with this case is that once the original psak was issued by the Bezdin, and then now it's been sort of percolating for 4 years or so, so it now has created a zakman alav b'milver situation, so that essentially it's turned into a hava. So therefore you can't collect the statutory interest. Then came along with Shmuel Vosner. Shmuel Vosner said, and I said it's a printed tshuva, he said that in addition to the fact that this is not the classic case of the sholem meshiv of a pigadon, that you could say a person who takes a pikadon, Shimon takes a pikadon from Reuven, everyone says he wants it back, and Shimon's investing it, so a pikadon is something that's normally used for an iska. You could say he was doing it for Reuven's purposes, so we understand it's turning over the profits, but here it's not a case of pikadon, in case of skivas, therefore it's worse. But number two, he says there's no havacha here. So he brings the criticism that we already quoted from the Beis Yitzchak and others. How can you possibly be meko when there's no actual havacha? And number three, he says, and this seems to be an implicit criticism or potential disagreement with the Sholem Meshiv himself, he says the earlier sources, namely the Ramah, the Mordechai, the Rav Yona, that the Ramah was quoting from, they didn't say anything about collecting money in court. They spoke about collecting money, from the individual directly when he didn't give his money back, and you could have used, and it's a question of menias revach or an implied revach or an actual known revach and so forth. But the idea that you would be able to collect something that the court itself is calling interest, there's no remez whatsoever from the Ramah or any of the sources regarding that. So the whole heter, he says, it's very difficult to get off the ground. And for good measure, he's very thorough. Rav Vosner throws in everything. He says, so what about the Marshal? Marshal says that even the source that the Sholem Meshiv was relying upon, the Ramah, has a dissenter, namely the Marshal quoted by the Shach. And even if you're going to tell me Chsam Sofer, you'll say, you don't really need Herviach, you just need a Revach Bar. Where's the Revach Bar? How do I know that there was a revach bara, that this money that was owed to the employer, that they could have used this money for other purposes? If it's a yeshiva, they probably didn't have the money anyway. If it's a yeshiva, they probably forget about like money market. They probably didn't have the money b'chlal. They have to go out now and start and raise the funds. And he said that if you want to invoke, what about Rabbi Eliezer Mitula based on the Bach? And in fact, the Beis Yosef, of course, ruled against Rabbi Eliezer Mitula. He says, in any event, the Shach disagrees. And as far as the Fseidah de Shukah, he throws in mamish everything. As far as the Fseidah de Shukah that Beis Yitzchak quoted from Beit Hillel, said it was never accepted widely. And by the way, Fseidah de Shukah, who was the Fseidah de Shukah for? It was for the Shukah. It was for the Shuk. It was for the merchants in the marketplace. It wasn't intended for Talmud Torah institutions. They have to pay this extra amount of money. So therefore, he says, you have absolutely nothing to work with. So for all these reasons, he held that the money should not be collected and it constituted an Ribbis. Then finally comes along, the Bris Yehuda. The Bris Yehuda says, hey, I'm the guy who's, going to codify the halacha. I'm the guy that they all read to find out what the bottom line is. So you got to know what I'm going to say. So he comes along in very, very short response. So he says, well, number one, they weren't Hirviach. They weren't Hirviach. So he also has like that obvious criticism. They weren't Hirviach. Number two, okay, you'll throw in Ksam Sofer. There was no Revach Bara. And number three is a little confusing. He says, you know what? There was no actual psak yet of the Arkos. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the Yeshiva deciding that to preempt the psak of the Arkos, they're going to voluntarily pay all of this amount. So he said that if they want to pay, and it's not stemming from an actual halva, so then he says that I don't know that it would necessarily translate into a Ribbis issue. Probably wouldn't translate into a Ribbis issue. However, he said better that they should make some sort of a pshara, since they're not actually chayav, and therefore have them pay 1/3 of the statutory interest. That's what he writes. Have them pay 1/3. So in other words, he doesn't feel comfortable following whom? The Sholem Meshit, but who does he ultimately feel comfortable following? Though I don't think he quotes him by name, the Avnei Nezer. He says you could make a pshar under these circumstances. Maybe in particular because of the fact that it is voluntary. And remember that the Avnei Nezer himself, if you think about it, he's sort of consistent with his psakim elsewhere. So the Avnei Nezer in Choshen Mishpat Siman Chav Gimel says that it's mutter for a bezdin to make a pshara when parties are arguing about whether something is ribbis altogether, and if the one party is telling the truth, it is ribbis, and the other party is telling the truth, it's not ribbis. So is a bezdin allowed to make a pshara in those circumstances? Do we worry that the pshara itself is going to invoke ribbis and it's a suffix isalach? He says no, because if you're doing it mitos pshara, so it doesn't count as ribbis. So maybe he's going a little bit along with that idea too. Maybe at least the Avnei Nezer. But the Piskei Choshen, very interesting. He seems to be comfortable with that under the circumstances. Very, very interesting. Now, one common thing, amongst all the respondents, is the reluctance either to apply the Sholem Meshiv broadly or to rely upon the Sholem Meshiv altogether, other than Rabbi who seem to, be comfortable with this idea of the Pshara, which is more kind of like the Avnei Nezer. He's taking both the Ramah into account and the Marshal into account. So, the bottom line is, if all you're relying upon is this idea of mevatel kiso shel chavero, it has its limitations. It certainly has its limitations, and as we saw in this case, all kinds of reasons not to rely upon it. But are there other considerations? So we spent a lot of time on the first one. We'll try to spend less time on the other three. But I want to spend time on them. So the next idea is knas. What about the idea of knas? Arguably, every single heter or kos, if the Bezdin says you can go to our kos in order to enforce your obligation, it includes the knas component. Now, there's a general question. When Bezdin nowadays gives a person a heter or kos, let's say there wasn't a psak of the Bezdin. We're just giving a heter or kos because the nitva refuses to go to Bezdin. Are we saying, like the Nesivos and Mishpah and others say, that we should tell the Tovea, we're considering your claim, and it seems that you only have the right to claim this amount of money, but if you collect any more than that, it's going to be gezel, because halacha wouldn't permit it only if the secular courts gave you. They're the only ones that would give you a higher amount, and that would be punitive damages or consequential damages or whatever that we would never award, and therefore you're not allowed to collect more than a certain amount. We don't do that. Rav Chaim Cohen has a beautiful article about this in the Divrei Mishpat, but he's not the first person to wrote about this. The Imrei Bina by Rav Meir Auerbach 100 years ago wrote about this package. He says, Bate Din, don't do this. Why is it that Bate Din don't do it? So Rav Chaim Cohen explained that really when a heterokos has a couple of elements to it. One is the idea Bezdin might issue a psak, and you tell somebody to go to court, so the court can tell them Aseh Mashi Solomim Lecha, like in the case of a get, right? But the other is like the Gemara in Baba Metzia, Baba Kama. Talks about you invite somebody and they don't respond, so you can throw a wall at them, and the Rosh calls up a paltrigon, throw a wall at them. What does that mean? It's not very nice. He says, no, it means a knas, that you can take the person to court under those circumstances. What does the Gemara mean? So if Chaim Cohn says, that Gemara is telling you that there's a knas component. That a person refused to go to Bezdin, so you throw the wall at them, that you say that now your Toveya can take you to secular court, and we're not even going to pay any attention. And even if the person collects so much more in the secular court than he would have been able to collect in Bezdin, it doesn't matter. You know why? It's a knas. That's a knas that we're imposing upon you, and it works on that basis. You could say, okay, so the same way that the person will be able to collect attorney's fees, and Bezdin is not going to intervene, so Bezdin is also not going to intervene with respect to a statutory interest either. But it could be that statutory interest is worse, because other knasos, so you could say, well, would have been gezel. The Bezdin is going to decide it's not gezel. We're going to impose upon upon the person it's a knas. But how can the Bezdin allow ribbis? Even the Bezdin of America, with its unparalleled integrity, does not have the ability to be matir ribbis. Can't do it. So you have to realize there are three different types of knasos, basically, that are discussed. One is that you have a knas that is for an actual hava, that a person loans money, and they say, if you don't pay me by a certain date, so then really I wouldn't charge you any interest, but if you didn't pay me by a certain date, so then you'll have to pay an extra premium. And we have a couple of Gemaras that indicate that should be like Heter Gomer, the person who was Pareya Mitzvah Chobo, said, if I don't pay by a certain date, so you can just keep all of that, and I'll you can keep the star, and the person is he puts the star in escrow, and if I don't pay by a certain date, you can pull out the star and you can collect the entire amount. And we say that's permissible. Mishnah Baba Masra, that's permissible. Person's malbeo al sadeo. Person loans money and he said and he collects from the borrower the mash as a mashgun the sada, and the person who borrows the money said, if I don't pay you by 3 years, you can keep the sada even though it's worth 3 times as much as the original loan. We say, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, the Chachamim allowed Baisis ben Zonin to do that, the Chatchila. So we see that it should be perfectly fine, and that's how the Ritva seems to paskin, because if the Lover would have paid on time, so then there wouldn't be any, there's no Argonauta penalty. It would have just, they had to pay the exact amount of the loan. There's only a penalty that's imposed afterwards. That's not Argonauta. As the Vilna Gaon says, it all becomes chayav in 1 second. It's not because of an elongation of the long term that this amount is being charged. No, it all becomes chayav in 1 second when the person doesn't pay on time. So that, according to the Ritva, according to the Midrash, is probably had to go. The one who says you can't do it, that's how we pass on the halacha, is the Rashba. The Rashba says in a couple of places, in Shuvah, Chelakal, Simtop, Rishon, now other places, the Rashba says you can't do it because it looks like haramis ribbis. Also, last came lechatchilim b'nei haramis ribbis. No, if it's also last came lechatchilim b'nei haramis ribbis, how could you have allowed the case of the person who's Povei Mitzvah Chobov Ishlish Shto, or the case of a person who's Mabeo Sadeo? No problem. Person who's Mitzvah, when the person paid Mitzvah Chobov, there was no ribbis. Afterwards, we are going to treat that as a matana, and then they're just paying the Karen afterwards. And since the whole thing is haramis ribbis, it's not something that has to be returned once it was paid. Same idea with Habeil Sadeo. That the Sada, once it was given over, so it doesn't have to be returned afterwards. And when it was given over as a mashkan, so it was given over in a mutter fashion. The mashka easily gets out of there. And Rabenu and the Rosh has a little bit of an easier time. He says, I can give you a better explanation. I'll give you a better explanation. The case of Habeil Sadeo, hard to say that you only allow that b'diavad when the Chachamim allowed Baisis ben Zunin to do it lechatchila. So that case is since you're giving money, and when you say, it would only be haramis ribbis, when you're getting back at the end, it's a field, it's not, so it looks like a commercial transaction, and therefore that's going to be mutter, and everybody would agree, including the Rashba, that it would be a lechatchila. Certainly, if you were in a business transaction to begin with, it was not a loan transaction to begin with in any way, and it was started as a business transaction that if the person didn't pay on time, you can have, even as a precondition for the sale, that there will be a knas payment that will be imposed upon the individual, the purchaser who received goods and didn't pay for it on time, within the 30 days or whatever, will have to pay an extra premium, a one-time extra premium, no problem. So that would be permissible. So if it is basically a hava case, we're going to be makbel like the Rashba that is considered to be a haramis ribbis. And if it's a business case, or it's money for, or it's money that was originally loaned, but what the Malva walks away with is a field at the end, something, a payros at the end. So we're also going to be makel about that. And the Ramah is makel in both cases. The Mechaber is makel certainly in Sif Yud Ches, in Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin, with respect to the Schora case, with respect to the case where the person originally loans money, and then in the end walks away with a Sada, walks away with payros as a Knas. The Ramah says, Yesh Matir, and the Shach says, yeah, of course the Mechaber would agree to that. And there's a long, I'm not going to go into it, a great length, a beautiful piece in the Shardea, where he shows that it's not really that the Mechaber would necessarily agree. The Mechaber might be following the opinion of the Rosh as opposed to the Ribbis, while the Ramah is going with the opinion of the Ribbis, and that there might very well be a disagreement, and that's why the Mechaber says, much to the Shach's confusion, that if a person's Mabel or Mashkon, and they're going to end up with more at the end based on the Mashkon being worth more money, and that's something which would not be allowed as Haramas Ribbis. And the Shach says, oh, but you're walking away with something other than money, so why is that a problem? So the answer is because the Mechaber is going with the Rosh as opposed to Rivash. It's a problem if you start as a loan transaction. It's a problem on the Lechatchila level. And the Ramah, who doesn't say anything in Sifya class, so you can say he was relying on the Yesh Matirin that he mentioned in Sifya Dalet and the Shalom Yisrael. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that you have basically these three different gradations. That if it's a halva case, so then a knas, even a one-time knas is a problem. If it's a business case, so then it's probably okay, and maybe according to the Ramah, okay. If it started as a loan, and then there's a knas that requires the payment of payers, and then you have knas misrabeh. What's knas misrabeh? That's when there's a knas, but it's not a one-time knas. It's a knas that the person who owed the money has to pay $2,000 day one, and then they have to pay $4,000 day two, and $6,000 day three, or compounded interest on whatever is the total amount, and it's knas misrabeh. So knas misrabeh says the Ramah that this is says the Mechaber knas misrabeh is a problem, and the Ramah says yes, knas misrabeh is a problem, even though there is an opinion that holds the knas misrabeh is not a problem. Who's the opinion? What are we talking about in our case of statutory interest? Statutory interest, if we're going to view it as a knas, what kind of a knas is it? It's not a one-time knas, it's a knas ha-misrabeh. Knas ha-misrabeh, because it's going to increase every single day, and therefore that would be a problem. Who's the one that said it's not a problem? It's the Rimi Orleans. So we've quoted like all of the special shitas now. We have the Rabbi Eliezer Mituk, and we have the Rimi Korkaiser, and now we have the Rimi Orleans, okay? The Rimi Orleans, what's his special kula? His special kula is that he made a star. He actually made a whole star. You look at source Lamed Aleph that says that if the lover doesn't pay on time, so then he has to pay every single week. He has to pay an extra amount of money. He has to give a certain amount of pshitin every single week. It's mamash knas misrabeh, and the Mordechai introduces this, and he says, "Wow, this Rav Yaakov Me'Orleans, what a great guy. He did a lavos Ribbis. He came up with a star that now you can loan Ribbis. Fantastic, wonderful." So some say the Mordechai was really criticizing him. He's saying, "What kind of a star is this? This is a star where you're going to be able to loaning the Ribbis." But if he really wanted to criticize it, he could have presumably used stronger language than simply saying, "This is the best thing since the Heteriska, especially since the Heteriska hasn't happened yet." So he said, "This is, something which might actually have some sort of a heter, and it enables us to do what otherwise would look like Ribbis, even though it's not actually Ribbis." The Beis Yosef says, "Ein lecha haramis Ribbis gedolos mizu." Why is it only haramis Ribbis? Because again, if the person would have paid on time, so then they wouldn't have to pay this amount. But once you have a knas misrabeh, some say, and the Shach quotes one day that holds that this is Ribbis midaraisa. Some say that this might be Ribbis daraisa. The Shulchan Aruch Harav says even in a business transaction it might be Ribbis daraisa, because what you're really saying is that you can keep on going and hold on to the money and not pay the money longer, and for every single unit you'll just pay me more money. So it sounds like you're essentially stipulating a Ribbis at that point in the transaction, unless you want to say, and this is what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says in the case of a gamach that's charging for a person who doesn't pay back on a free loan. He says for every single week or every month they have to pay an extra amount of money, and Shlomo Zalman seems perfectly okay with that. Unless you say that there's really never an agreement by the one who is imposing the knas, that just because you're paying extra knas for every single week or for every single month, that I'm really letting you hold on to it. It's just that I'm imposing more of a penalty because I'm getting angrier and angrier and angrier. Because every single day I want that money back immediately. I'm not letting you hold on to it more. It's just I'm getting so angry that I'm imposing a bigger penalty. I'm imposing a penalty according to the Godel Ha'avla. That's the lashon of Shlomo Zalman. According to the Godel Ha'avla. So therefore, you could say it never quite rises to the level of Ribbis Derais, and the Sma probably held that way. Because the Sma had a bunch of takanos that these are published in the Shayos L'Tshuvos or Tzadikim. I will admit, I didn't look up. That's a secondary source. But in the Shayos L'Tshuvos or Tzadikim, it's codified from the Sma that there were certain takanos that he accepted, his own Seder D'Shukah takanos, so to speak. And one of the takanos was that they allowed a Knas Misraba of the ilk of the New Orleans to be employed. Again, that hasn't caught on, and we do worry about Ribbis Derais in this particular context, but Shlomo Zalman doesn't. Shlomo Zalman says it would be now maybe Shlomo Zalman was being Mako because of the fact that he was dealing with Moshe Yisovim, he's dealing with the Gamach. But again, if I was really worried about a Ribbis Derais situation, I couldn't be Mako with respect to Moshe Shel Yisovim. I could just say maybe he wouldn't be Mako if it wasn't a Gamach because he holds its Ribbis D'Rabbanan, and Ribbis D'Rabbanan you can be Mako with a Gamach, but can't be Mako with somebody else. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say it, but you could argue that. But at the very least, he seems to be accepting the fact that this wouldn't be Ribbis Derais. And this is something that the Bezdin in Netanya, when they were trying to find potential justifications, so they said they liked this one. The main decision was written by a Dayan. Does anybody know him? Or Tzion Luz?
Yeah. Oh, you know him.
Oh, he's the.
You lose. You change it to lose.
Oh, okay, fine. Is he the new?
And he's been on Beit Din Gadol for like 8 years now.
He's been on Beit Din Gadol for 8 years. Okay, fine. So he wrote the opinion. The head of the Yoshe Rosh was Rav Eliezer Igra.
Also on
right. Yeah. And he said that he thought that this was not such a terrible svara to rely upon. He said that because you could to take these two considerations into account. Number one, the idea of knas, and number two, that if the money is really being stolen per se, then maybe there's no actual ribbis, and it's just a question of to what degree can we really be machaya from a batel kiso shakaveo, as we had in the previous discussion. We said you put these two things together. He said that here it seems to be pretty clear that we're not dealing with a situation where the person who's looking to enforce their judgment is happy about the fact that he had to wait so long to enforce his judgment because he's able to collect extra money from it. And particularly when the Rashba was worried about haramis ribbis. What does haramis ribbis mean? It means that the outset of the transaction, you're going to say, oh, if you don't pay me on time, you pay me a certain penalty amount, and like the shtar of the New Orleans. And that for every single week you'll have to pay me an extra amount. That looks like haramis ribbis because it's structured in a way that a normal ribbis transaction would normally look. That, oh, you'll pay me an extra amount every single month, this amount of interest and so forth. But when there was no interest ever stipulated, the person just had money owing to him and so forth, it just never got paid, and now he's enforcing it in court, and the court's the one that's imposing the interest. So who's doing the harama over here? There's no harama. I would have been perfectly happy if the person would have complied with the Bez in the first place, or would have agreed to show up to the Bez and have the case adjudicated. There never would have been any statutory interest. So what kind of harama is this? There's no harama on the part of paying the person who's paying the interest. Oh, great, I accomplished my goal. I really wanted to pay that statutory interest. No way. And there's no harama on the part of the person who's collecting the statutory interest. Therefore, they think that this is actually a very good svara to rely upon. The only thing is, they said that it has to be that under these circumstances, we don't want that it has to be a knas. The idea of a knas is that it's not something which is tied together with whatever happens to be sort of like the cost of living index of some sort of like an interest rate that you see what the interest rate is out there sort of in the marketplace, and you want to make the person whole. It has to just be that you're applying. If you are simply talking from the standpoint of knas, then it would have to be something that's less tied together with sort of the overall concept of ribbis. And he says that while that's something we could do, from a Bezdin perspective, we would impose a knas, even a knas misrabeh. It could be that what the secular courts have in mind is that they're really just charging something which is meant to resemble 100% what would be normal interest. So he said we had somebody investigate this. We had somebody investigate basically the congressional Knesset record of exactly what the thought process was when they instituted the statutory interest altogether. So we turn to our Ozer HaMishpati. Who was the Ozer HaMishpati? None other than our illustrious alumnus, Rabbi Meir Orlean, Shlita. So Meir Orlean went and he investigated according to this psak, and he found that it was a little bit suspicious, that they sort of incorporated both considerations. There were knas considerations, but they also tried very hard to come up with sort of statutory amounts that matched what would be sort of an interest consideration of what people would earn from interest and so forth, that it really was intended to sort of match whatever would be kind of accomplished through the imposition of regular interest. So they said it would be very, very difficult for them to break down sort of the aspect of the statutory interest that was purely punitive and the aspect that was meant to really impose something that was actual interest. However, at the end of the day, they said, we don't have to, because they spent maybe 5 pages analyzing some provision in the Knesset legislation, which I really had no patience for whatsoever. And they had some sort of esoteric discussion in which they said, if you look at paragraph 2 of the Knesset legislation and you figure out the lumdus of why it said this one, not that one, and this line it said it this way, and this line said it the other way, and what they must have meant was as follows. So they darshan the legislation, the Knesset, that it's not that when the Bezdin would authorize somebody to go to court in order to enforce a judgment, it wasn't really making any reference whatsoever to the statutory interest. That's triggered totally separately, and therefore it's not the Bezdin's responsibility. They take no blame, they take no credit, and therefore whatever happens, happens. They don't have to worry about it. I did not understand that part of the psak at all. But that is with respect to sort of this idea of relying upon the knas, which they liked. What they didn't like, well, was the next part, which others say this is the best heter. This is the best heter. And that is the heter of the Ramban. Namely, that Ribbis, which is collected against somebody's will, is not really Ribbis. Where does the Ramban come up? The Ramban comes up in the context of the kingdom that changed the coinage. They said that the kingdom made a law that if you made a loan with 1 coin and we are going to change the coinage, and now the coinage is going to be like a coin that has much more silver in it or something like that. So when you pay back the $5, the $100, whatever that you owed before with the $100 of coins, it's actually going to be worth like $200 now. So it really would be objectively interest, but because Dina de Machusa Dina, therefore we don't have to worry about it. And the Ramah Paskins like this Ramban in a Siman Kuf Samech Hey. What is it based upon? So the Beis Yosef explains why this would not be a problem. So he says the reason why this is not a problem is as follows. Because this Tosefes was not something that was stipulated. It wasn't something that was negotiated between the Malva and the Lover. It is being seized, like you would seize Gezel, like you would hold somebody up with a gun. And so it's against the Rosh and the Baalim. The Malay Dino Shemachos Eno B'Chlal Ribbis El B'Chlal Gezel. So therefore, it does not count as Ribbis, but it simply is Gezel. Elishadino Shalmalchus din. But once we say din in the Malchusa, that this is the way that the Malchus is requiring you to pay it. So because they're in charge of minting currency, it's no longer Gezel. That's great. You get out of Gezel. The ain't got Ribbis, and it's not Ribbis. Why is it not Ribbis? The simple reason of the Ramban is it's not Ribbis. That's the simple meaning of the Ramban. That's the way everybody always read the Ramban. For some reason, these Dayanim, they didn't like that reading of the Ramban. That's not what the Ramban meant. No, it has nothing to do. It's not Ribbis because it wasn't known that they're going to change the coinage beforehand, and there's something new that came onto the horizon afterwards. That's what the Ramban has nothing to do, whether it's Baal Kocha, Baratzah. I don't know what they're talking about. To me, that's probably the best heter. They thought it was the worst heter. Now, what happens that not everybody has the approach of the Ramban in understanding why it is that this case was okay. The Chavos Das gives 2 other explanations, but the Chavos Das's explanations are not really brought down the Dina by the poskim on the Daf. And the 2 explanations of the Chavos Das are number 1, it's called the Skal Hefset. That there's a chance that the Malchus is going to produce a new coin that's going to have more silver, and there's a possibility they're going to produce a new coin that's less silver. So therefore, it can go either way. It's called the Skal Hefset. And that's the reason why it's okay. And then the other explanation is because the Xeris HaMelch is the Tovas Atzmo, it's to feed the coppers of the government, and therefore it's something which is viewed as Hefker as an Hefker. A totally separate reason why it's not based of why you wouldn't have a problem of Ribbis, because it's Hefker Bez and Hefker, to just take away everybody's money so nobody's paying any Ribbis, is for eminent domain or something of that sort. Those are his two explanations. Now, the first explanation, the Sefer Trumos, who quotes the Ramban, says already that's not true anymore, because nowadays they only raise they only change the matbeos in order to raise the amount of each matbea, not to lower the amount of value of every single matbea, and therefore, or whatever the matbea's buying power is going to be, and so forth. So therefore, and despite the fact that the Sefer Truma says it's only Karv L'Schar, he still quotes this heter. So it seems very difficult to make the argument that we don't really rely upon the reasoning of the Ramban. If anything, Rav Shalom Yosef Gelber, author of Nesiva Shalom, makes an argument in the other direction that maybe Chabas Das, in terms of what he was worried about, is only when the government is sort of forcing people to enter into voluntary Ribbis transactions. But as a general rule, if it's not voluntary, it's being collected Baal Korcho, so then the Ramban basically is the Shita that's more accepted lahalacha. So what does that mean? What does it mean? So if I say there's no Ribbis when something is Baal Korcho, so what is it then? It's Gezel. So that can make things worse. It can make things better, depending on the circumstances. How can it make things worse? So Rabbi Willie was on such a case. Rabbi Will was on such a case. If I recall correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It was a case where the husband hadn't paid child support, and the wife goes and she collects the child support, I think from a Bezdin ruling of child support potentially. And she goes to court and she collects it, but they give her statutory interest. Now the question is, the husband says she has no right to have the statutory interest. So on one level, we say, well, they didn't stipulate that it's going to be that the interest is going to be paid. It wasn't a loan transaction. So it's no worse than Avak Ribbis. So Avak Ribbis is Eino Yosef B'Dayadim. She already collected the money, so there's nothing to discuss. Rabbi Landisman said, no, that would be true if we were talking about Avak Ribbis. But this is worse than Avak Ribbis, because since this is Baal Korcho is a totally different story. If you collect Ribbis Baal Korcho, says Rabbi Akiva Eger, even if it's Avak Ribbis, not only is it Yosef B'Dayadim, but we even say you're the Nechasa. Normally, when it comes to Ribbis, there's no Shiva Nechasa. We don't say you're the Nechasa. Here we would even say you're the Nechasa. So it's actually, and even if it's only a back Ribbis, it says Rabbi Akiva Eger. So therefore, in this case, for sure, she has to disgorge it. So that, but if that would be the case, it's not because of the Ribbis. That's the thing. What is Rabbi Akiva Eger saying? He's not saying because of the Ribbis. He's saying because of the Gezel. But then that's very easy to fix. How do you fix it? You fix it the way that you would fix any kind of a Knas situation. You fix it by saying to it that it's that the Bezdin permits the collection. The Bezdin permits the collection. They impose a knas. They say, we're allowing this knas that you're going to be allowed to collect the money. So they're not allowed to be maksha ribbis. But we just said, according to Ramban, there's no ribbis here altogether. It's just a question of saying it's not going to be a gezel problem. So if the Bezdin says, we think that the husband did such an avlo, that it's appropriate for him to pay over this extra amount to the wife, under the circumstances, so then it's not going to be a gezel problem. And then not only will she not have to disgorge it, but it would have been much for the chatzkiva to collect it, because then you don't have a gezel problem, you don't have a ribbis problem. So this is something which is discussed by Mordechai Rabbah, an article that he has in Shura Sedin Chelet Tezvot. He deals with an identical situation. He says, I consulted with two eminent poskim. Who are the poskim I consulted with? Chaim Kanievsky, pretty eminent. And I also consulted with Rosh Yosef Gelber, the author of Nesiva Shalom. It's a very eminent poskim. And they both agreed that if it is collected Baal Korcho, this type of situation, no stipulation of ribbis to begin with, not a loan transaction, it's just they're collecting the amount against the person's will. So under these circumstances, they both said it's not considered to be ribbis. The only thing is that Rav Chaim Kanievsky threw in one little pnech. He said that about ein roi lasos came in a shenira ribbis. It's not right to collect when the court is going to impose statutory interest because it's near Ribbis. Now this near Ribbis is not like the Rashba's Haramis Ribbis, because it's nothing that was stipulated by the parties. They just says near Ribbis. So says Rav Gelber. So Rav Gelber came along and he says near Ribbis we can negotiate. We can negotiate a near Ribbis that's something that's going to be a new fangled rabbinic creation for this type of situation. Sholem Meshiv, Avnei Nezer, okay, then talk about this idea of Nira Karib. It's just, when is it going to be permissible or not permissible? So he said that under said Rav Gelber, if I'm dealing with an abla, that's a worse abla, I'm dealing with an avla that this person is refusing to pay child support and is abandoning his children and making his wife's life miserable. So then it's more important to take care of the wife and to be matir the collection than to worry about the Nira Ribbis in this situation. It's very interesting because if you get to the end of this tshuva by Rabbi Rabbah, completely rely upon that. He didn't completely rely upon that sort. But that's what Rabbi Gelber says. And I think that probably gives a sort of the discretion to a bezdin in any particular case to figure out if it is something that's I can't imagine. And I don't know why the Sholem Yeshiva and the Amines didn't deal with this. That's a kasha. That's a kasha because it's a very good kasha. Why didn't they have such a good heter? Why did they rely upon this heter? It's an excellent kasha. I don't have a good answer to that kasha. The Dayanim of the Bezdin and Gadol would say we have a good answer because it's not a good heter. But apparently, Chaim Kanievsky didn't think it was really Ribbis, and the Nesiv Shalom doesn't think that this is really Ribbis. Rabbi Rabbah didn't think that this is really Ribbis. But it becomes then a discretionary exercise by the Bezdin to determine when is it necessary to correct an avla, to allow this sort of thing, when not even the Bris Yehuda. But Bloy seemed to say that in this situation, it's just sort of a question as to whether we have sufficient grounds, al pi halacha, to impose a knas, whether we have sufficient grounds al pi halacha to say this counts as mebato kisa shukha be'o, this say to the shukha, things of that variety. So that's why he said, since it's not clear that we have sufficient grounds to allow a pshar in this type of in this type of situation. But that seems to be a very worthwhile svara to consider for these types of situations. Even the svara of Rav Gelber to say that something is near a Ribbis, it might be something that can be revisited, is something where there's I found the precedent in a shula by the Rashba in Chelek Aleph Tav Kuf Lamed Ches 938, where the Rashba speaks about a person who promised to a shvua he was going to pay certain iska profits, and then afterwards he kinda I can't be Makai my shvua because it really wasn't really true. It was really a halva. It wasn't an iska, it was really a halva. And if I pay these amounts, it's going to be ribbis. And the Rashba said, that's okay. If you pay the amounts now, it would be you took so long to pay it, it would be no worse than ribbis mucheres. Ribbis mucheres, it's only a drabanan anyway, and it's better for you to be potentially over on ribbis mucheres than to violate the shvua deraisa that you took. This Rashba is a true Rashba. So that sort of also you can take into consideration when dealing with the fact that the Ribbis Val is probably a very attenuated version of Ribbis. Now, again, if I'm dealing with the enforcement of an interest contract between the parties themselves, it's a different story. But here there was no contract between the parties to pay interest. It's just something which is being imposed by the courts. So then there's more room to negotiate. Then the last thing that I was going to mention, but I really mentioned it already, so I'm just going to mention it quickly, is the idea of Shalohu Notel. That the Ritva says that based on the Gemara that talks about the loaning of Daf Ayin Hey and Aleph, how a person, strictly speaking, could loan money to his Badim Ketanim and collected interest. Because why is that? Because my demosif lay lovim midideu the lay, because the children who are somech al shulchano are just giving him his own money. So therefore, a person's just collecting his own money. That's not really interest. The only reason why we don't allow it is still ma'asi l'misrach. So says the Ritva, that if somebody owed you money for theft or some chov she ain't got ribbis cloud. The mind mostly play lover in the day who the other labor is bar. Because since the lover owes the money anyway, because he had previously stolen money from the malver, so then you're allowed to actually make a loan to this gazlan afterwards. That he should pay you the amount of the loan plus the amount that he previously gazzled from you, the amount that he previously stole from you, or the amount that he owed you from something else. Even though the way you're phrasing it is, I'm making you a loan of $100 and you have to pay me back $120. But you and I both know that extra $20 is something that you stole from me in the past. Maybe it was Ribbis that you stole from me from the past. It doesn't matter. You stole it. You stole it. So says the Ritva, that's mutter. They say, oh, come on, what am I finding these far out, Ritvas? I can also look and find weird things in the Rishonim. But what does that have to do with the Halacha L'Baisen? The Bris Yehuda paskins that way. Bris Yehuda parakid al Halacha Ches Hayach Abeo Chayav Locho Sheru Yachal Osim Menu Mitlavas Lo Manashti Parolo Gamos Locho. That he paskins this exact case. The person owed you money, so you're allowed to loan with him al Manasha that he's going to pay this extra amount of money. So as I said, if you have a bezdin that sort of knows that the court is only going to award a certain amount that the person is entitled to from the bezdin judgment, or otherwise. So the Beth Din could say, as long as both parties understand what this deal is, and you don't have a deal ma'asim in the mitzvah issue, they could say, go and you can collect the statutory interest so that you will be able to collect everything that's really owed to you according to the Beth Din judgment. So that, I think, would also be, again, I imagine that's not such a common scenario. I did get such a shiloh once. That's why I didn't bring it up. I did get such a shiloh once. So I think that's something that could potentially be considered. There's a B'Tselach Chachma that I won't go into at great length about what if the person didn't get a heter hakos? What if it wasn't there enforcing a Beth Din? They psaka the Beth Din. What if it wasn't a Chaburah? They went to court. They weren't supposed to go to court. Now the court imposed statutory interest. Now the lawyer wants to know what the defendant wants to know what to do. The defendant goes to Beth Din and says, if I pay the statutory interest, there was no heter from the Beth Din under the circumstances, so I don't want to pay interest and I'm not allowed to pay. But if I don't pay it, then they're going to come into my store. They're going to seize my merchandise. All the customers are going to see. It's going to be a big embarrassment. It's going to be all over the headlines. I'm going to lose my entire business. I'm going to lose my entire store. How much do I have to give up in order not to violate the Ribbis of paying it now that the court has ruled against me? Very fascinating case. But Zelachachma said, number one, don't worry. If you really don't owe the money altogether and it was just some hideous decision that the court made that had no basis whatsoever, so whatever you pay, it's just gezel that they're collecting from you. It's not Ribbis. There's no issue for you to pay. If it turns out you really did owe something and they're imposing interest upon you, so then he says, since we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua, that you have is some truma that's falling from some barrels, some wine, you're allowed to be matami biyad, so it doesn't, you're not mafsikulim. So as we all know, that isam mituma gamiran. Actually not, but I don't know. I can't figure that out. But he says that we can, derive from in that case of the truma that it's just like you could be matame the truma, so to be able to pay the ribbis in order to avoid losing more merchandise and more business. I didn't really understand that, but what I guess he's primarily relying upon is he says there are other things going on over here. It was a mecha transaction. Number two, you're going to have in mind when you're giving it to this matana. You give it as a matana, so it's not really the lover is avera. So in the malva is avera, and as far as being moshe to the avera to the malva, you don't have to worry about him so much, in terms of everything that's being done to you to avoid hefsed. And finally, he said that it was the original merchandise was given over between the lawyers, and the money is being paid through the lawyers. So therefore, they have the heter of Rashi that it's not really Ribbis about the love of the malva. It's an unbelievable tshuva, but he finds ways out, whatever. A person in that situation, I'm not sure if they can rely upon every single aspect of this heter, but it shows that there's at least what to discuss. So again, to conclude, I have no idea how long we've been going, but I think for a while. So my sense is, oh wait, I see a 4 at the beginning. So now it's 5 o'clock and that's okay. So my sense is that Bate Din are not so proactive when there's a heter hakos that we give a heter gavia for them to go to court to enforce the judgment in terms of the possibility that they may collect a statutory interest. According to based in the Ruin in Eretz Yisrael, it's better sheval tasya adif, because if we start intervening with this stuff, it's going to be yatsa scharo behefsedo. They're not going to take the Bate Din seriously. They won't go to us anymore. We're not really responsible because of our interpretation of that statute. I don't know. It's a little bit flimsy or a little bit questionable in terms of how they came to their maskana. It's a very strong tshuva, but the maskana seemed, you'll forgive me, it seemed a little wimpy. But in terms of our, is that okay? I don't know. You're just saying this a little, not so forceful. Let's put it that way. But in terms of our own responsibilities here in Chutz La'aretz, where we don't have to deal with maybe the politics that they're dealing with, so I guess that I would just conclude by saying that maybe we have to be a little bit, more thoughtful about these things. The general minhag is shei b'al taseh, but maybe it's something that's kedai for us to flag the issues in order to make sure that these types of collection actions not run afoul of any Ribbis problems.
Who's saying next one?
Next week, you have a blight.
Back to Monday.
Is there a light still here?
I don't think so.
No. Okay, we'll ask about that.
Okay. I got it wrong.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Sorry for the technological difficulties. All right, Rabbi Blythe is still here.
Oh.
I'm here.
Okay.
Can we do Monday, Rabbi Blythe, at 3 o'clock?
I think so, but somebody else objected last week.
No.
Someone objected to Monday.
Regardless, Rabbi Willie can't do Tuesday. If Rabbi Blythe can give Chaburah on Monday, that would be
Yes.
better.
Okay. What
Great.
Monday?
Great.
Okay.